Guten Tag, Zuhörer. Ich begrüße euch im Namen von der Bund-Organisation in Melbourne. In die kommenden Wochen wollen wir euch bringen kurze Diskussionen wegen verschiedener Unionen, was haben zu tun mit jüdisch Leben und Kultur. My name is Allan Preiss. Thank you for joining us today as we examine the role of the media in covering the constantly evolving coronavirus situation and its impact on our community and economy. Joining me today in our podcast are Michael Gawenda, former editor-in-chief of The Age from 1997 to 2004, and Benjamin Preiss, a current state politics reporter at The Age. Michael was the editor of The Age when the Twin Towers bombing occurred in 2001, arguably the biggest stories that would have been covered in his time as editor. Benjamin, as I said, is a current state politics reporter and is covering many of the stories related to the coronavirus that are appearing in The Age today. I'd like to start with you, Michael, if I could. What was it like trying to cover the stories related to 9/11?
Well, look, I've been thinking about this because you mentioned before that you wanted to start with that. And I think that 9/11 was probably a huge story, a very big story. But in terms of its challenges for Australian journalists and Australian editors, I think there were bigger stories in my time. I think the Iraq War was bigger because Australia was involved directly in that war. Australian journalists were there covering the war. I think that was bigger. I think in some ways the Bali bombings were bigger because they were in our region and directly affected Australians. And in some ways I think the Timor independence movement and the battles between Indonesian soldiers and the Timorese people was a very, very difficult story to cover. So I think that as an editor, if I compared those stories to the challenges today, here's some of the challenges that I think were similar, but are probably more extreme today. One was my concern for the safety of my reporters who were in Baghdad during the war, or were in that compound in East Timor, I don't know if you remember that, when the militias were attacking people on the streets, killing people on the streets, and they certainly wanted to kill Australian journalists. So safety was a huge issue in that time for me, and concern about how much should I let my reporters that worked for me and that I was responsible for, how much should I let them go out and put themselves in danger to get a story? They always wanted, my experience was, they all wanted to go further than I was happy for them to go. And so I was constantly thinking, how do I pull them back? With 9/11, we had one reporter in Washington who we lost contact with. Her name was Gay Alcorn, and I can remember the concern about that. And of course, you had, so that was one thing that I imagine editors and TV producers and radio producers need to have in mind. How much risk am I prepared to take, risking the lives of my reporters, the health of my reporters, to cover this story? And a simple thing is, how often do I let my reporters go, even though there's social distancing, there's still risks, go to doorstops or to cover press conferences? Why do I need them to be there? Why can't they cover a press conference the way we're doing this, in the same sort of way without taking those risks? So that would be a parallel concern to me. But there is an extra element here that I don't think all the stories I mentioned don't have. I think that and I think that this is particularly difficult at a time where all the news outlets are competing for instant news, for getting ahead of the curve, for getting stuff out before anybody else or as quickly as possible. If we got things wrong about, for instance, what was going on in 9/11, I mean, I can remember at first we thought there were 10,000 dead, and we actually had a first edition or a morning edition that got a lot of things wrong in terms of where how many people had died, how many attackers were there, where did they come from? Because this is a lot of stuff that we didn't know. And I can remember that in some of the reporting, it was being reported, and we ran it, that there were still all these attackers on the loose and other things planned. And American authorities were desperately trying to get across. So what I'm saying is we could do speculation, and it wouldn't necessarily have a shocking effect. We could get some things not right and it wouldn't matter that much. That's not the case with covering this pandemic. You can't get things wrong. You can't make mistakes in your reporting. You can't speculate, or you shouldn't, you can't speculate about things based on some sort of anonymous sources that you're not sure they even know what's going on, because everything you report is consequential to the way people obey the rules, the fears that you might engender, the panic that you might induce. So I'd imagine I never had obviously you always want to get things right. I never had the experience of having to constantly think, is this accurate? Is this 100% accurate? Are we speculating too much? Are we going to cause panic? Are we going to cause people to do things that we don't want them to do? So I'd imagine that editors have that concern, people who run newsrooms, that should be at the front of their minds. And I think that in turn makes reporting of this more difficult, more stressful than anything I experienced over 40 years as a journalist, including 30 of those or 25 of those as a reporter.
Michael, if I could, I'd like to get Benjamin's perspective on what you've just said. And I want him specifically to focus on two things. The first one is your concern about sending journalists out to doorstops. And secondly, the consequential nature of any errors that would appear in the stories that they write. So, Benjamin, what's your feeling about those two issues that Michael's just raised?
Well, we've got quite clear protocols about going to doorstops now. We've been taking it in at the Age. We've been taking it in turns to go to just the kind of the most necessary doorstops that the Premier might be doing, or the Chief Health Officer, which happens pretty much every day. And when we get there, it's quite different to the normal doorstops that we would have been doing 2-3 months ago. Everyone's standing, quite far apart. And there's like the Premier, whoever's doorstopping, whichever minister it is, or whoever from the health department is generally standing behind a kind of a temporary fence, like tape. So it really is quite different to any kind of doorstop I've ever done before. The doorstops at the Department of Health, which are usually inside, I mean, the seats are spaced quite far apart, and there's hand sanitizer when we get there. So it's a really, really different experience to anything that I've ever done before in terms of doorstops.
Do you
but to get to your
Sorry, do you feel at all uncomfortable about going to the doorstops?
I feel all right about it at the moment. I mean, I feel like we stand far enough apart and, you know, follow the kind of the social distancing guidelines pretty closely. Yeah, I mean, like I said, everyone, the Premier, whoever's doorstopping stands a fair way away from us. So the other thing is going into the city is very quiet at the moment. So I feel like we're following the social distancing rules as much as we can. But
what about your colleagues in television, Benj, who I often see standing there on the street doing their thing to camera with people walking behind them, next to them, often standing in fairly crowded places? I mean, that seems to me to be taking risks that are pretty significant.
Yeah, that's. I guess that's possibly true, and I guess it's a question of how far you go to get the story. I don't think that we would be allowed to do that, to go and interview people face to face and be in close proximity to them unless we've had it cleared or and that's been kind of approved by our managers. Yeah, so I guess TV and broadcast is a different thing, and I mean, I would hope that sometimes maybe it looks like they're closer than they are, or they've got a microphone on a pole or something like that. I would hope that they're taking the right precautions. I'm not there in those kinds of situations. So I don't know for sure exactly how close they're getting, but I don't think I'd be comfortable being sent to crowded places at the moment.
Benjamin, how much additional pressure do you feel about the stories that you're writing, given what Michael was saying earlier about the significance and the consequential nature of any errors that might appear in stories that are written?
I don't think I've ever had an experience before where so much of the journalism that we do is being followed minute by minute. And it's quite obvious and clear that people are kind of basing their plans or their behaviour or what they're going to do, the precautions they're going to take based on the things that we report. So, I mean, obviously there's a huge responsibility that comes with journalism anytime, but I feel definitely a much greater responsibility and an obligation to get things absolutely right at the moment. Because to get things wrong or badly wrong, it could be dangerous here. So I don't think any journalist wants that on their conscience.
Did you believe that the editorial staff at The Age and other newspapers for that matter too are sensitive enough about that consideration?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody wants the consequence of getting something wrong on their conscience. You wouldn't want to be part of anything that led to any kind of people taking unnecessary risks or or people engaging in anything dangerous based on what you reported. So yeah, I mean, these are incredibly difficult circumstances also because things change all the time. Like things can change from hour to hour in a day, and I had that experience a few weeks ago, where the story was just changing minute by minute. So, yeah, I think that that there is a sensitivity to that.
Right, Michael. What do you think would be going through the minds of the editorial staff now? What would they be talking about at their hopefully virtual editorial meetings in terms of getting out a newspaper on a daily basis?
Well, I think that the environment in which journalism has changed so dramatically since I was an editor that I imagine that there are ongoing meetings all the time because everything is being updated all the time. There's not one editorial meeting in the morning and then another one in the afternoon and then one before the paper comes out. But I would hope, I don't know what's happening, I would hope a few things. One, that the protocols for covering the story are clear for all the journalists that work in the organisation. In other words, what are the risks? What are the things that we have to have in place in order to keep safe? How are those things implemented? And every day I'd be checking to see that they're being followed. That's the first thing. The second thing that I would have done as an editor is have mass meetings of the staff via video about what our journalism's about, the things that Benj was just talking about, to recognise the pressure that journalists are under, to get them to understand that we understand the pressure they're under, that here are the ethics which we've always followed with our journalism that are much more important now than they ever were in the past, and here's what they are, and here's how we're going to conduct our journalism. I would hope that's happening. If it's not happening, the other thing, there is one other thing. I'd make it clear that counselling is available for journalists who feel stressed by covering this story. It can be an incredibly, I'm sure, traumatic experience covering this story. Even if you're not at the hospitals, even if you aren't, but you know about it, you talk to the doctors, you can feel stressed. Some people are talking to people, I imagine, whose relative, father, mother, whatever, are on ventilators in the hospital, or are, obviously there's a protocol in place here that you don't name individual people, which I think is the way it should be, until they're dead, it seems. But I think that it's very important to offer journalists support. We never did when I was editor, but I think it's become clear with research that's been done post journalists covering traumatic events, that they suffer from a form of trauma after effect that needs help, that many do, that need to talk it out, that need to speak to people. So I hope that's being put in place as well. So and amongst the staff, I imagine that staff must be people, journalists, you'd know this better than me, Benj, that, you know, there is a kind of collective sense of doing journalism. The newsroom is a place that should be abuzz with people talking about what's the news, what are we covering, what are those bloody editors telling us to do that are ridiculous. But at this time, the newsroom's empty. Most people are on their own. Now, Benj, you could answer that better than me. Are journalists, is there a virtual newsroom? Are people talking to each other about the challenges they're facing covering this story?
Yeah, I think that journalists are talking to each other. I'm trying to talk to my colleagues as much as I can anyway, because we're not in the same room anymore, and we can't just meet up for a coffee or see each other. Or I'm a little bit isolated anyway because I don't work in the main newsroom. So I've got my own. I work in the Spring Street bureau where there's usually just three of us. So the three of us have been speaking quite a lot. The state political team. I've also been speaking to people in the other journalists in the newsroom a fair bit as well, and obviously we've got contact with editors too. I think counselling is available, so I don't know how many people take that up, but I know that The Age offers that. But also, there's kind of no two ways around it. Journalists miss seeing each other. There's just as we all miss our colleagues and our family and friends, journalists miss having those kinds of conversations every day with their colleagues about what they're doing, what they're working on, what they've been asked to do, all of those things. So that's another kind of layer of complexity and just another difficulty and challenge that we're facing with all this going on while we're trying to work at home and, you know, feed our kids and make sure they're doing their schoolwork and all of those things.
Michael, I want to take us in a slightly different direction now. A couple of weeks ago or something like that, you wrote an article that first appeared in Plus 61J and then The Age ran it about your experience of age in the time of corona crisis. But what I wanted to take up with you was an idea you floated in that article where you said that the role of the media now should be also about campaigning to make sure that the government's messages are supported, and they should be looking at ways of involving people that younger folk relate to rather than just hearing Daniel Andrews' voice. Could you elaborate a little bit more about that idea?
Well, I think that for us to expect that young people, and I'm talking about now people in their late teens and to mid-20s, for instance, maybe a bit older than that, to actually listen to Scott Morrison or Daniel Andrews or some of the health experts who are all well over 50, and some of them are older than that, talking about the dangers of a virus that are mainly about the dangers to older people, and expect them to listen, I think is a big ask. I think that's a big ask. I think they've never listened to politicians. I don't think they've been interested in politics, many of them, except to think, oh, these are just, they never tell the truth. So, so what I was saying was, and I think the media has got a role, and in some places they have done that. Spain, for instance, has taken their national football team and they have all sent out messages telling people to be safe, telling young people to stay safe, because there are young people, because you might be harming not just your grandmother or your grandfather, but also yourself. Now, we haven't done that. I don't know why we haven't done that, because I reckon, for instance, if you went to the AFL and you went to whoever runs the AFLW, you would easily come up with a campaign of footballers, men and women, from each of the clubs talking about why it's important for them. We know how hard it is. It's hard for us to. It's terrible that we're restricted in the way we are, but we have to do it, and we have to do it at the moment because of whatever. Scripts could be written for them. I think that would be a good thing to do. The evidence still is, certainly in New South Wales, the evidence still is that people under 40 aren't listening, or a significant proportion of people under 40 aren't listening. And why is that? Well, how do you know that? Because of all their infections, over 40% are people under 40. They are not isolating. They are going out. Look, so I'm saying, I'm surprised that none of the TV stations have done that. Channel 7 is suffering hugely because it can't do footy. Well, get the footballers out there on your station talking about this. At least, it reminds you of football. The Herald Sun should be doing it, for heaven's sake. The Herald Sun, I don't know if you want to say this, the Herald Sun's in great danger. Not having football is killing that paper. If any paper's going to die as a result of this, it's going to be the Herald Sun. So they should be out there with footballers. Not just footballers, musicians, a whole lot of things, that young people can relate to.
Thanks for that, Michael. And I'd like to take us to a final issue to discuss today, and that is, how would you assess, both of you, the way the government, be it state or federal, have handled the media side of things? We hear reports about Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand being the gold standard for this in terms of her ability to be direct, clear, strong and empathetic at the same time. How do you think our politicians have handled the media side of the coronavirus situation? Benjamin, if you could.
Well, my perspective is particularly Victorian, but I think that, like, looking at the federal side of things first, I think that Morrison maybe had a bit of a wobbly start. I think that there was a bit of probably the message was a bit confused in the beginning, at least anyway, and that this whole idea about him potentially saying he was going to go and watch, his rugby side play that weekend when, the Grand Prix was already being closed down. I think that that confused a lot of people and, fed into a lot of confusion there. I think that was a little bit puzzling. But in terms of Victoria, I think that the sense I get out there is that Daniel Andrews is regarded as quite a clear communicator, and I think that it's also been quite clear that he's been wanting to go quite a lot harder in terms of restrictions than the federal government has wanted to. But the state government has also had some wobbles. They had this whole kind of episode about partners not being able to see each other if they lived separately, and then they backflipped on that. So perhaps there wasn't a kind of clear, cohesive message the whole time on that particular thing. But I think overall they've had the state government has had a pretty clear. Obviously, there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of there are grey areas, but they seem to have this kind of singular message: if you can stay home, you must stay home. And I think they've done a reasonable job of trying to convey these things. But I think one other thing that we don't have that perhaps they did in New Zealand is we haven't had from the beginning a clear set of stages. So we didn't know that stage 1 means this, stage 2 means that, stage 3 means the next level of restrictions and exactly what they are, and so on. We didn't really have that. It's been sort of more those things have kind of been decided more as we've gone along, and as the infection rate kept going up.
Michael, your perspective?
Well, look, I always think compared. When you ask a question like that, compared to what? I mean, I think, for instance, I agree with everything Ben said about the wobbles at the start for Morrison. And you've got to remember, he started off from a position where he had been a kind of miserable failure during the bushfires. And there was a sense that he would never recover from that failure. And at the beginning of this, when he said that stuff about going to the rugby and I'm going and we all should go, well, I thought, well, here we go. But I do want to remind you, Benj, that Andrews was very late with cancelling the Grand Prix. I mean, it was till the last minute after the teams had all arrived, after Italian team infected with coronavirus arrived in Australia. I mean,
that's right.
So that wasn't a great start either, really.
That's true.
He could never really explain why it wasn't being cancelled, except to say that was his medical advice, right? So there was wobbles, but I do think this. I think, in my view, from a distance, as a former editor, I think Andrews has been the outstanding political performer. I think, why do I say that? Because when I listen to him, I feel like, and others, I get the sense that he means what he is saying. It's not some script that he's reading. He has come to this after examining evidence, after listening to his medical people, after being involved in the National Cabinet. He sounds like someone who is wrestling with this issue every day, which is what you want, and is then coming to conclusions that you can understand. Yes, there are wobbles. I think the meeting with your significant other was a bit of a wobble, and I still think the holiday house thing is a wobble. I mean, you can go but don't go. I mean, what does that mean? Absolutely don't go, but you can if you have to, if you want to. I mean, that remains a problem. I think we're the only state that allows people to go to their holiday homes. So there's always going to be wobbles. But I do think he's been an outstanding performer. In contrast, Berejiklian has been terrible. Absolutely terrible. Every time I see her, I think she's not on top of this. She's saying contradictory things. And of course, they had the debacle with the Ruby princess, and their health minister is an absolute debacle as well. So they've got, I think they're the contrast. Morrison is somewhere, he's not that. In my view, he surprised me. I think that he has grown in some way with this crisis. He may not be Jacinta Ardern, but he was never going to be her. But in his own way, it feels to me like he's kind of real in a way that I'd never seen him real before.
And this is where we have to leave today's discussion, which featured Michael Gawenda, award-winning journalist and former editor-in-chief of The Age newspaper, and Benjamin Preiss, an Age state politics reporter. We hope you enjoyed our time together, and we look forward to you joining us next time. Until then, bleibt in der Heim und bleibt gesund.